this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we will discuss the different approaches to command and control of the British and German armies. From a management point of view, both organisations developed different doctrines to deal with the fog of war, or friction, which affected how commanders responded as a battle unfolded. We'll be doing this by delving into the origins of each nation's different approaches to doctrine and training, and most importantly, how these strategies played out during the pivotal Battle of France in 1940. Joining me today is Martin Samuels. Martin is the author of Piercing the Fog of War, The Theory and Practice of Command in the British and German Armies 1918 to 1940, which builds upon his earlier work, Command or Control, Command, Training and Tactics in the British and German Armies 1888 to 1918. Martin, welcome. I guess we need to start by discussing doctrine and how each country viewed command. The German army produced in the 1930s Truppenführung, which captured much of its philosophy of command. Can we sum this up? Was this a new thinking, a break with the past? I know that's sort of three questions there.
So Truppenführung is probably the most famous manual of military doctrine that's ever been written. You go through the modern literature and you can't help but trip over all sorts of references where people say, this was amazing, this was incredible, this was the clearest expression of military doctrine that anyone has ever come across. I mean, it is seen as the pinnacle of military doctrine. And the fact, military doctrine is not something that most people find terribly interesting or exciting. And so the fact that this manual gets that treatment is quite something. So it's really worth looking at. I think I'm going to give the inevitable historian's answer, which is, yes, it's revolutionary, but no, it's not completely revolutionary. There's an awful lot of continuity in it. So let's give a sort of quick summary of what the key essence of that manual is. And I think for me, it's absolutely clear that the authors of Truppenführung see warfare as non-linear and chaotic. It is an interaction between independent wills. You therefore get unlimited variety. There's enormous uncertainty and there's an incredible lack of information. That for them is the basic reality of warfare. There's no getting away from it. It's just like that. And you can't stop it being like that, so you have to respond to it. And so essentially what they say is you have to have initiatives. Leaders at every level, they have to show initiative and they have to do stuff. They can't be passive. And there's a really famous sentence that essentially says inaction is a worse crime than error in the action that you choose. So do something, even if it's not the right thing. But the key thing is that you do that something in the context where your commander has told you, this is what I'm trying to achieve. Now you go off and do whatever it is that's necessary to achieve what I'm trying to achieve. And to do that, they say that so not only do you have to have enormous initiative, because of that chaotic, unlimited variety nature of warfare, opportunities are going to come up suddenly and unexpectedly and briefly. And so you have to be able to act really, really quickly. You have to make a quick decision and you have to implement that decision really quickly. And if you have all of those pieces together, then you will be successful in warfare. And that's the model of command that I call directive command. It's not quite the same as mission command, and I very deliberately chose a slightly different term from the mission command that's common in armies nowadays. But essentially that's what I call, you've got a clear directive. What is it I'm trying to achieve? And you're commanding someone as opposed to controlling them. But this is part of the genius of Truppenführung. It says, actually, all of that's true, but the commander needs to be at the decisive point personally. Because if you as the senior commander are at the decisive point yourself, you can see what's going on. so you can get a better understanding of what's going on. You can make a quicker decision because you can see the position, and your decision can then be communicated quicker. So you make a better decision quicker at the key point. And in that situation, you're going to be able to work even faster and even more effectively. But because you're there and you're telling the troops what to do, that's a model that I call directive control. So you are controlling what your troops do, but you're only doing it at the absolutely key point. And wouldn't you want your senior commander, your best commander, to be at the key point saying what should happen?
There's obviously a sliding scale of where that key point is and how far back it is, presumably.
Yes. So that's essentially what the doctrine says. So is it revolutionary? Well, it's written better than any of the previous manuals. It's one you would actually want to read. And I think it's worth noting that Ludwig de Beck, who was the main leader of the group that wrote it, who became the chief of the general staff almost as soon as it then got published, he was actually quite a creative chap and was a skilled writer. And so there's something that the Truppenführung is not a boring read, particularly the introduction. It's only a few hundred words, but it is lyrical and it is actually quite beautifully written. So it grabs you in a way that none of the previous manuals do. However, it's not really that revolutionary. So if you go back to the pre-1914 regulations, so you're going back before the First World War, more than 20 years before, actually there's really clear in the regulations then, of the German view, warfare is chaotic. You've got the interaction of the enemy will and rapidly changing situations. It's going to be chaos. There's a strong emphasis on the initiative of subordinates. They need to do stuff. It's not as strongly put. It's not as emphatic as it is in Truppenführung, but it's a question of degree as opposed to a switch. And one of the other things that's quite interesting is that before the First World War, there's actually quite an important emphasis on commanders not being too close to the front line. But the logic of that is don't go too close to the front line because you will end up making decisions that your subordinates should make. So it's actually all about not cramping the initiative of your subordinates. And it's clear all of that is very much down to Moltke. So that's Moltke's philosophy. And then in the First World War, because of the context of trench warfare, there's a greater emphasis on speed and surprise. Ironically, in a trench warfare context, things move more quickly. And so there's a pressure on the commanders to be further forward. And then you have, after the First World War, in 1921, Hans von Siegt, the commander-in-chief of the German army, publishes a new manual, Führung und Gefecht der verbundenen Waffen, command and control of the combined arms. And that really does emphasize warfare as being chaotic, the need for initiative and action, and a very strong emphasis on commanders being right at the front line. And if you look right through a sort of 50-year period of German manuals, repeatedly there are whole sentences that you see that are repeated manual after manual after manual, and a lot of them are used again in 1933 in Truppenführung. So some of the key elements of this, it's not revolutionary. These are things that Moltke wrote in the 1880s and 1870s.
Fascinating. I wonder if the command, how close to the front the commander is expected to be or not be, shifts with the fact, just the simple fact of communications change from the 1870s when you've got telegraph through to telephones through to early radio in the late 30s, and actually the commander can be shifted about at different positions.
Well, it's one of those interesting contrasts. So Schlieffen, he writes that the modern commander, and so he's writing in about 1907, 1908, and he says the modern commander sits behind his desk with a row of telephones and commands his forces from there. Siegt, writing in the manual in 1921, says corps commanders should be in the front line. And it's specific, it says not, division commanders definitely, corps commanders should regularly be in the front line because that's where you see what's going on. So there is a complete contrast. And yet, Schlieffen has telephones and a corps commander has radio. So you could argue that a corps commander in 1921 actually has better communications. But it's that point of being there on the ground and seeing it for yourself.
Yeah, and there's that picture you often see of Rommel hanging out the back of his radio.
Yes.
half-track thing that he's got then.
And I think that's a really important point with Rommel. So I'm sure we'll come on to Rommel in more detail in a minute. But one of the things that stands out about Rommel is that certainly up until 1940, so when he's a battalion commander, company battalion commander in the First World War, divisional commander in the Second World War, he is keeping in touch with his superiors. He's actually being really careful always to tell them what he's going on, what he's planning to do, where he's going. He's not just rushing off into the blue yonder. He's actually being really, really cautious and saying, "This is what I'm going to do," just checking that that's okay. So that picture of him being sort of impetuous is a bit at odds with the truth.
A year after the German manual comes out, the British update their field service regulations. I mean, how do the two documents differ? I mean, the British presumably they've come out the First World War with one set of ideas, but at the same time they're a colonial police force, is the British Army. So are they completely doing two different things, or do they have the same sort of problems, do they envisage the same sort of problems to overcome?
So field service regulations, as you say, it's the British equivalent. It goes through a series of different editions between the wars. Interesting, the Germans have 2 editions of their core manual. The British managed to get 4 in, which I think is a sign of they don't really quite know where they're going. But I think it does put the lie to what Little Hart used to say about the British didn't even really think about the war until the 1930s. Actually, field service regulations was on its 3rd post-war edition by the early 30s. So field service regulations, a further edition comes out in 1935. They have volume 2 is about operations, and there's an absolutely brand new, never had a predecessor, volume 3, which is about higher formations. And this is the first time ever that the British have a manual about how do you command something that's bigger than a division. Worth noting, the Germans had a version of that in 1869. A mere 76 years later, is that right? 66 years later, the British come up with a volume. And I think it's interesting that Wavell writes this. He's on half pay. So we have a general who we haven't really got a proper job for. What should we get him to do? Oh, we'll get him to write our most important doctrinal manual. And he does a really interesting job. I think the version of field service regulations that Wavell writes is, I think, fascinating because it's full of paradoxes. And I think it reflects some of the things that you were just saying. So Wavell writes the manual, and it's clear that he sees warfare as being non-linear and chaotic. But commanders need to address that in a structured manner. So it's trying to impose order on the inevitable chaos of warfare. So the Germans say you can't impose order on the chaos, you just have to live with it. Wavell's saying, no, it is chaotic, but you have to try to apply structure. He then has the paradox that he says that subordinates need to exercise initiative and they shouldn't be constrained by detailed orders. But then he says, you really, really shouldn't change your orders. And so there's this real paradox that on the one hand, you're supposed to show initiative, but you're supposed to show initiative while following the orders that you've been given. So sort that one out. And really, what for me comes out is I think it is that point that you're making, that contrast between sort of the colonial police force role and the major European war. And what I think comes out quite clearly is that for the British Army, there was a view that because the British Army was quite small in peacetime, a major war army was going to be much, much bigger than anything that they had. And by definition, therefore, most of the people in it would be pretty inexperienced. And therefore, the odds were that they wouldn't be able to exercise much initiative because they wouldn't know what they were doing. And so you have a sort of paradox that you say, well, warfare is complicated and chaotic. People need to exercise their initiative, but our troops aren't going to be able to exercise their initiative, and therefore we're going to have to tell them exactly what to do. And that is essentially the position that the British found themselves in the First World War, that they created from the small regular army of 1914. They created the Kitchener armies. The Kitchener armies didn't really know what they were doing, and that's not meant as a criticism of them at all. But you know, I mean, in previous research, I remember looking at a couple of Kitchener divisions where if there was a pre-war officer in the battalion you were doing quite well. So people really were learning from scratch. And so this is sort of an understandable position. And really that goes right back to the 1909 edition of Field Service Regulations, which was written by Haig. So this is when Haig is in the War Office before he becomes commander of First Corps. And he plays an absolutely central role in the development of the British doctrine before the First World War, and the doctrine that then the army fights with through the war. And he really has that emphasis that as senior commander, you impose structure and you tell your troops what to do. And to some extent, I think that's based on a belief that we're going to have armies, large armies, that won't be able to do anything more than that. And I think, again, that gives you an interesting paradox because, in a sense, it's true that in a major war, you're going to be fighting it with an army that is dramatically larger than your peacetime army. And therefore, you're going to have very large numbers of troops brought in from scratch. And there is a question about how much you can train them to do. But of course, exactly the same applies to the German army. And indeed, even more so, because if until at the point where Beck is writing in 1933 and Wavell's writing in 1935, the German army is 100,000 men. There is no equivalent of the territorial army because it's been banned under the Versailles Treaty. There are effectively no reserves of former regular troops because Versailles says you have to have a 25-year service. So apart from that 100,000 men, there is nobody. And yet the Germans equally recognise there's going to have to be a mass army if there's going to be a big war, and you can train it to have initiative. You can train it to recognise those fleeting opportunities. So in fact, the British and Germans are in almost exactly the same position in terms of peacetime army expansion into wartime army, and they take a directly opposite conclusion.
It's interesting because that's very presumably, and this might bump into your previous, but the British Army had learnt in 1918, the idea that the man on the spot does take the initiative was one of the things that the British Army had learned.
Yes, and I think it's one of the things that we've learned, and it's a trap that I myself absolutely fell into. So my previous book, I finished with the March 1918 offensives, which obviously were a classic of British rigidity and German flexibility. And I stopped at that point and said, well, there you are. That's the contrast between the two armies. And I was wrong. And it's one of the things that I tried to do in my latest book, which is why I have a case study about Amiens in August 1918. And the British Army, even just a few months later, is so much more advanced. Still, some issues about it, but yes, the army of the 100 days is a flexible, man on the spot, initiative, flexibility army, and then it gets lost.
We have two manuals. What is interesting is it's all very well writing manuals. People don't always read them, or they're not always disseminated. Or how well was the information these manuals put into practice, trained with, drummed into people, and did everybody, all levels of the British and the German Army, understand what was in those documents? So
again, I think there's an issue of real contrast between the two armies. So the Germans, for 50 years, have had a tradition that the General Staff publish the doctrinal manual, and then alongside it, officers will publish sort of how-to guides and advice, explanatory texts. If you look at the literature, every time there's a new edition of the main German doctrinal manuals, you then see an explosion of official and semi-official publications which say, well, this is how the new doctrine is different from the old one. Literally going through paragraph by paragraph and saying, well, this one's gone, this one's come, this is what all the change is about. So that there's a real scope for people to be looking at, well, so this is what it means and this is how it's changed. As I say, it's official and semi-official. It's very clearly guided by the General Staff, and there's a significant effort made to do that. And I think, if we look at, again, picking up with Rommel, he's famous for his book Infantry Attacks, and that's held up as this extraordinary and unique book about his tactical experience in the First World War. And it is, it's brilliantly written and it's absolutely gripping. It's actually quite typical of the kind of thing that was being written in Germany for 50 years. And it's important to remember that Rommel, at the point where he writes it, is a senior figure in the German official officer training system. So in effect, at the point where he writes Infantry Attacks, Rommel is, as it were, the senior instructor at Sandhurst. So it's the equivalent of that. So surprise, surprise, it becomes a book that if you're an officer candidate in the German army, you're going to read it. But it's not unique. There's lots and lots of other books around. And then the Germans then constantly try to get people to sort of think about the doctrine. That they have huge numbers of staff rides in their training system. And they're very clear there's no school solution. Here's a tactical situation. We're all going to look at it. We're all going to come up with our answers, including the instructor. And then we're going to discuss all of those solutions. And then we'll take the best one and we'll use that one as the basis for the next stage in the exercise. And that best one may well not be the one that the instructor came up with. But there's lots of practicing it. And then the other thing that they do a great deal of is that they repeatedly will put in training situations, they'll put officers into a position that is two ranks higher than their official rank. You're a lieutenant, you're in command of a platoon. You may well find yourself in a staff ride in the role of a battalion commander. And that goes right the way up. So if you're a general staff officer and you are the chief of staff to a division, in the staff ride, you may well find yourself commanding an army. And the key thing is it gets you to think about the issues from that perspective. And as I said before, the essence of the German system is you need to have a clear commander's intent. You need to understand what you're trying to achieve. And you need to explain that to your subordinates so they know what the point is that they're trying to get to. And then you allow them to get on with it. If you're a platoon commander and you have regularly practiced being a battalion commander, you see things from the perspective of the battalion commander and you can understand the intent that battalion commander is trying to do. And so you can make the connection. Huge contrast for the British. The British General Staff say there must be no other documents that go alongside the doctrine because that might confuse people. This is from before the First World War onwards. The General Staff deliberately say we are not going to publish any official or semi-official guidance to the regulations. Officers should read them and understand them. If we provide guidance, then it's going to take away from the essence of that doctrine. And so it will constrain the officers. So what inevitably happens is that nonetheless, there is a huge outpouring of a material to explain the doctrine, none of it written by people who are anything to do with those who wrote the doctrine. And so you have classic examples. So J.F.C. Fuller, between the wars, he discovers that his officers are not reading field service regulations because, by golly, it's boring. And therefore, they don't really know what it's about. And so he writes his lectures on FSR2. But he's not doing it because he's in sort of the inner circle. He's doing it because, well, I'm a brigade commander. I have troops who need to know about this, so I'm going to write something about it. And the absolute classic then was he then wrote lectures on FSR3 and then got it noted that the publisher was writing to the War Office saying, well, can we get copies of FSR3? And at that time, it didn't exist. It hadn't been written. So Fuller was writing guidance notes on a manual that he thought the army ought to write, but they hadn't written. This is before Wavell did write FSR3, which is actually on a different topic. But it's a sign that there's no official attempt to guide people as to what the regulations mean. And there's an absolutely classic example in a General Staff conference from before the First World War, where they're having a debate about this. And one of the officers there said, look, these manuals are written so obscurely, they're about as useful to a frontline officer as if they were written in cuneiform. Can we please have some guidance? And the General Staff say no. They have to read the manual and make up their own mind.
It's fair to say it's down to decentralisation, the two different approaches. The British would like you to be decentralised but do as you're told, whereas the Germans are quite happy to let you kind of...
I think there's a lot in that. And I think that the difference is that the British think that the senior commander can impose order on the battle. And that essentially, it's going to be chaotic, but as the general, you can see what's going on, and your calm understanding will impose order, and therefore you can tell people what to do. And I do find myself wondering whether that's in part a reflection of the fact that you made reference to colonial and policing. In that sort of relatively small scale operation, as a battalion commander or as a brigade commander, which is as big as most operations got, in the 1890s and early 1900s, you probably can still see the whole of the battlefield. And I think that isn't the biggest operation before the Boer War that the British are involved in is Wolseley when he's in Egypt in the 1880s. And I think he has 2 divisions. And I think that is the biggest field force that the British Army puts into the field from the Crimea right up until the Boer War. And again, in that position, as the commander, you can pretty much see what's going on. And so I think your experience pushes you in that direction. Whereas you contrast that with the Germans, in 1866, Moltke is trying to run the war against Austria. He's got multiple armies on hundreds of miles across the front, with commanders running off and doing their own thing. There's no way that he can control what's going on. There's no way he can see exactly what's going on. And therefore, he sees that reality that in major warfare with large forces, you don't know the detail. And I think the other aspect that we have to remember there is that, of course, Moltke was personally taught by Clausewitz. Moltke was a student at the Kriegsakademie when Clausewitz was lecturing there. And of course, Clausewitz is the one who says there's this thing called friction, which is essentially, the sort of summary of it is what can go wrong will go wrong. And Moltke imbues that, and that guides the whole of what he does. And the contrast is that in the British Army, Gemini was the theorist who was sort of adopted. And Gemini is all about geometry and order and points, fulcrums of manoeuvre. And friction is not a factor in Gemini.
Well, again, it's probably easy to work out friction against a colonial force, whereas I guess when you're in Germany, you're a central power surrounded by the enemies, and their experience looking outwards is different. And then you've got their experience of, Franco-Prussian War, which is a very different sort of experience to fall back to think about than the British experience when you're walking around Africa and India and Afghanistan. And
that's true. And of course, the Germans, Prussians have much more of an experience of large-scale continental warfare. And they have the example of, and I think I'm right in saying that at the Battle of Jena-Auerstadt in 1806, the disastrous defeat for the Prussians. One of the reasons why that's such a bad defeat is down to friction, which is that I think the commander and the second in command of the Prussian army get killed within the first few minutes of the battle because they happen to be in the wrong place and get shot. And that's a classic example of friction. And of course, Clausewitz was there. So he sees the consequences of these things. It's important to recognize Clausewitz is not some armchair general who sort of sits in theory. I mean, yes, he never commanded large forces in battle, but he was involved throughout the Napoleonic Wars. He went, I think he was involved in at least a dozen battles personally. He saw warfare in its raw state, and he saw how it worked. So he wasn't he wasn't like me writing about it, not based on experience. He had been there. Some of his descriptions, you can tell that he's been there personally. He's seen what it's like. And that's the fundamental basis for him. Gemini, of course, hadn't.
Hello, listener. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm pacing the fog of war with Martin Samuels. Should we look at practice? You look at Rommel in the book, the Battle of France, or the Battle for France even. So how is Rommel working his magic in that May 1940 sort of campaign? Is it straight from the manual? Is he operating from?
Rommel's a really interesting character. When I looked at what he was doing, three things really stood out to me. The first was he's at the key point. He's at the front line. He can see exactly what's going on. He can respond accordingly. He's often in severe personal danger from that. People around him are getting shot all the time. Amazingly, he does regularly get wounded, but he obviously doesn't get killed. He's at the key point. He has this strange ability that he can work out where that key point is going to be. So he's there at the point where it becomes the key point, but that gives him an enormous advantage. He then is really quick. He really insists on doing things quickly. So he makes quick decisions and he then implements them quickly. And that's both himself and his troops, that he'll see a situation, he'll think for a few minutes, he'll make the decision, and then he will get the troops moving. So he operates at a very, very high tempo. And then the third thing that really stood out from his actions is when things change, it doesn't surprise him. It may surprise him, but it doesn't put him off his balance. So there's an example in May 1940 when he's just crossed the Meuse, and he's got a few troops across, and he gets this radio message that says they've been surrounded by the French and they're about to be wiped out. And he doesn't go, oh gosh, what on earth am I going to do? He goes across the river, he grabs a few tanks, and he rushes forward to that position with some troops, and he's there really, really quickly. As it happens, the report is a false report. It's part of the friction of war, but he's there, and so he can say, "All right, this is the actual position." And rather than us being surrounded by the French, they clearly haven't got a clue what's going on. Right, we're going to advance, and he advances another 20 kilometres that evening because he can see the situation. So he's at the key point. He's really, really quick. He responds to situations and isn't troubled when things don't work out the way that he's expected them to. Well, that feels pretty similar to what I've just been saying about Truppenführung and the German doctrine. I don't think there's any suggestion at all that what Rommel is doing as a divisional commander, he may be particularly good at it, but I don't think there's any suggestion that he is operating counter to the German doctrine. And in a way, as I said, it would be really astonishing if he was, because most of the 1930s, Rommel is a key player in the training of almost every single German officer candidate throughout that period. By 1939, he's probably personally trained about a quarter of every single junior officer in the entire German army. And the 3/4 that he hasn't trained have read his book. I cannot imagine a situation where this chap is seen to be somehow not embodying the doctrine. You don't take, the chap who is in effect the senior tactics instructor at Sandhurst, make him in charge of all officer training. If you think, oh, he's not sound, he might go off and do the wrong thing. I think actually what that says is that he's being promoted because he is the embodiment of the doctrine. He is uniquely good at it.
It makes you wonder, because the historiography of Rommel very much characterises him as this brilliant, maverick, unorthodox outsider. Yet he does seem to be working within the framework of what he was meant to be doing. But it does make you wonder where his reputation comes from as this outsider. I mean, I wonder if they saw it like that at the time of him, or is that a British construct or a post-war construct?
I think it's a post-war construct. In a sense, there are different things that you can be an insider and an outsider of. So I think Rommel is absolutely at the very heart of the German doctrine. He is probably, in some ways, its greatest exponent, its most perfect embodiment. He's not a member of the general staff, so he's not an operational commander in that sense. And I think actually, quite a few people have said Rommel essentially, he remained the commander that he was in 1917. He remained an incredibly bold battalion commander. I think that made him a brilliant divisional commander, I think he was quite a good corps commander. I think he was, beyond that, I don't think he was a very good army commander, for instance. So he's not a member of the general staff. So he's not an insider in that sense. And that's part of the reason why Hitler loves him. So Rommel gets his divisional command in 1940 because of Hitler. The army was going to give him a division, but they were going to give him a mountain infantry division because that was his background. Rommel said, "No, I want a panzer division. No, this is what's interesting now." He pulls strings with Hitler, who he knows personally, and Hitler gets him that position. So I think he was, as it were, from a tactical doctrine perspective, an absolute insider. He's an outsider to the general staff. After the Second World War, that's really convenient. There are people who are looking to rehabilitate the German army. And of course, if you're looking at the position in the late 1940s, there's the whole shift where, of course, the Americans and the Soviets fall out with each other. And there starts to be a sense of, well, we're actually going to need all the allies we can get. And the Germans seem to be quite good at fighting the Soviets. So we're probably going to need a German army. But we need a respectable German army. And Rommel has this huge ability, this huge potential, that he was part, at least indirectly, of the July 44 plot against Hitler. So he's got some good anti-Nazi credentials, a bit wobbly in reality, but it looks good. And he never fought on the Eastern Front, and therefore wasn't involved in all of the atrocities. And the whole issue about the Wehrmacht not having been involved in the atrocities on the Eastern Front. I mean, that's a myth that has been well and truly dealt with now. But Rommel never fought on the Eastern Front, so wasn't involved in that. So you have a position where he's seen as being a brilliant general. He's seen as being clean because he's not been involved in atrocities. He's seen as clean as not having been too close to Hitler because of the July 44 plot. And it doesn't do any harm that one of the people who is at the absolute centre of setting up the new German army after the Second World War was Rommel's chief of staff. And so it's quite convenient to him to say, well, my boss was this perfect embodiment. So I think it is very much a post-war thing. And I think it's also that classic thing of when you've been beaten by someone. So, the British obviously had a rather difficult time with Rommel in North Africa. It's easier to say, well, he was a genius. Anyone would have been beaten by him. It wasn't anything to do with us. Anyone would have been beaten by him. I think the reality actually is that Rommel shines partly because if you look at who he's fighting against the Italians in 1917, not exactly renowned for being the most effective fighting force. He's fighting against the French in 1940, not exactly renowned as being the best fighting force. He's fighting against the British in 1941 and 42. Well, what's the subtitle of the official history? Britain's fortunes reached their lowest ebb. So it wasn't exactly the best army that Britain had ever put forward. So actually, all of Rommel's successes are against armies which are probably at the lowest point in their military history. And surprise, surprise, this chap, who is the embodiment of what is a very good German doctrine, does spectacularly well against them. He probably shouldn't have done. It's important, we have to puncture the Rommel myth. Because his approach has huge risks to it. So this point, I was saying that he's often he's at the critical point. It's quite dangerous, but it's quite dangerous, and actually that's quite important. That you look at the position in North Africa. How many people in his staff get killed or wounded, and these are officers that actually the German army probably can't replace. And I looked at a position for the German army as a whole during the Second World War, and there are some really useful records available of what the losses of German officers were, German commanders, German generals during the Second World War. And let's just sort of put this in contrast. That I think I'm right in saying that through enemy action, 5 British generals were killed during the Second World War. And that includes Herbert Lumsden, who has the misfortune of being on the bridge of a battleship in the middle of the Pacific in 1945, and a Japanese kamikaze plane hits the ship, and he's killed. So 5 British generals killed during the war by enemy action. Others are killed by plane crashes and the like, but 5, right? 1943, the Germans are losing 8 a month, and in 1944 they're losing 16 a month. These aren't wounded; these are killed. So 8 German generals a month are being killed in 1943. 16 German generals a month are being killed in 1944 and 1945. That's quite hard to keep going. That has a real impact on your army.
It shows you how they are presumably playing out, both sides are playing out their doctrine as one is really being at the front and directing the battle.
And then there's a second thing. So Rommel's system depends on him being at the right place at the right time. He regularly gets it wrong. And so if he's in the wrong place, then clearly he's in the wrong place. He's not at the right place. And the risk is that he will overemphasize what's happening where he is and think that he's in the key place. And it's interesting that Kesselring repeatedly makes comments and is quite critical of Rommel that as an army commander, he's off somewhere at the wrong place. Kesselring doesn't say you shouldn't be at the front line. He just says you need to be at the front line at the right place. And Rommel is often not at the right place. He's just off. He's at a place. And I think a classic example of that is the dash to the wire during the Crusader operation in late 41. Rommel takes his forces. He's in the wrong place. He's misjudged the battle, and Auchinleck is able to take advantage of that. So being at the front line works if you get it right. But it can lead you to lose perspective. And then the third thing that comes from that is that if you're at the front line, you're clearly not commanding the rest of your forces. And so you have a situation again in North Africa. So in the Gazala battle, Rommel goes off and he's trying to be at the key point, but he's got an entire army which is needing to be commanded, and the British are doing various things. They're not sitting there passively. And it's left to his deputy chief of staff, who's a colonel, effectively to command Panzer Army Africa, because Rommel's off somewhere. Now, luckily, the German system of command meant that Westphal, as a deputy chief of staff, he may only be a colonel, but he's practiced commanding at these more senior levels, and he's not terribly troubled by this. So he says, okay, right, and essentially he runs the army for a day. But it's not an ideal position to be in.
Being in the wrong place, is it interesting? When I was going to take us back to 1940 and look at how that British counterattack at Arras, the tank battle, because Rommel isn't there when the British put in that punch. But is this the British? How does the British approach that? Can we see their doctrine coming into play? Because it's always bigged up as being this big punch that makes the Germans stop and think.
Yes. So Arras is absolutely fascinating because it's the could-haves, the possibilities are enormous. I mean, it probably was the decisive action taken by the Allies during that campaign, and it is probably the event that allowed the Dunkirk evacuation to happen. In that respect, it's the Arras counterattack saved the British Army and potentially avoided Britain being defeated. So it is in fact of decisive, of war decisive importance. It's a complete disaster from the British perspective. So it's one of those things where the operation itself is a total disaster, and yet it has a decisive impact.
Losing our way to victory.
Absolutely. Yes, that's perfect. I love that. So we're in a position where in middle of May 1940, the Germans have penetrated through the Allied lines. They've crossed the Meuse. They've actually reached the sea at Abbeville. They cut the British and French forces apart. And it's sort of what are we going to do? And so the British and French agree that actually what they need to do is they need to do a counterattack, and Arras is the logical place to do it, and to cut through from north and south to cut off behind the panzers. So in that space, the panzers are rushed off to the sea. The infantry are marching as fast as they possibly can, but there's a gap between them. And so what the Allies need to do is to advance north and south, fill that gap, cut the panzers off from their supplies, and then they're stuck, absolutely stuck. And the British have plenty of forces to do that. So there's been lots of debate in the literature about, well, did Rommel overestimate the forces that were available to him? I don't think he did at all. I think it's clear that there were substantial French and British forces available. Ironside, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Gort as the commander of the BEF, and Bilot, who's the local French commander, they see that. They see they've got loads of forces. This is what they need to do. And they agree on the morning of the 20th of May, they say, right, this is what we need to do. And then they don't tell the man on the ground. When I pieced it together, it was really quite peculiar. So the British and French senior commanders work out a plan. There's going to be a substantial pincer attack. The British are going to attack south from Arras. The French are going to attack north towards Arras. Lots of forces available. They then tell Franklin, Harold Franklin, who's the commander of the British forces in that area, they tell him that he's supposed to clear the area south of Arras, which is not the same as you are going to be launching the most important armoured offensive that is going to save the army. And Franklin clearly knows there's something odd going on here. So he has various conversations. He talks to Ironside. He talks to the local French commanders. He talks to Gort's chief of staff, Oliver Leese, and lots of people are hinting. They're saying, "Oh, good luck with the attack, and I hope it goes really well. And God, do you think you've got enough forces to do it?" He's saying, "Well, but all you've asked me to do is to clear the area south of Arras. What's going on here?" But I think this is where the British doctrine becomes fatal in that regard. But the British have got a doctrine that says, don't tell the man on the ground what to do. Only give him the information that he needs so that he can deliver his task. But what they interpret that is give the commander on the ground the minimum information so that it doesn't constrain what the commander is doing. But Franklin is left saying, I don't know what I'm meant to do. But because the doctrine also says don't go against your orders, he's saying, well, I can't change my orders. And I've gone back to my commander and I've basically said, what's going on here? And they haven't told me anything different. So, well, I'm going to have to clear the area south of Arras. And so he is in this very strange position of he doesn't really know what he's trying to achieve. So he then is in the fortunate position that one of the commanders that he has on the ground, Gifford Martel, is probably one of Britain's leading armoured theorists and leading armoured thinkers. And he happens to be there commanding 50th Division, a very good territorial division. And Franklin gives him the 1st Army Tank Brigade, which is a couple of battalions of infantry tanks, heavy infantry tanks. And Franklin essentially says, well, off you go then. Clear the area south of Arras. And there's a logic to it. Because, as I say, it fits with the doctrine that don't tell the commander on the ground what to do. And Franklin is thinking, well, Martel, he knows what to do because he's the armoured expert, not me. So there's a logic there. But on the other hand, Franklin doesn't know what he's trying to achieve. So Martel doesn't really have any clear guidance. And then what also comes out, and I have to say, Franklin's memoirs are really striking because of their honesty. And Franklin says, look, I've been a staff officer for years and years and years. The last time I commanded anything in battle, I think it was a company. And I really felt incredibly nervous and I couldn't really impose my will on my forces. And as I say, the honesty of that is quite striking. And so I think you're also in a position where Franklin is quite nervous. He's nervous as a senior commander. He's in effect now in commanding a corps. He's never done anything like that before. He's nervous of that. He's nervous because he's got Martel, who he thinks knows what he's doing, whereas Franklin doesn't. And he's nervous because he's tried to find out what Gort wants him to do, and he doesn't. He doesn't know. So in that sense, he's doing the right thing, but I think he's doing it probably for some of the wrong reasons. And I think it then gets shown because Franklin then sits in his headquarters. Having told Martel, off you go, he then sits in his headquarters and waits for Martel to tell him what's happened. And I contrast that with the German doctrine, which is, as a corps commander, you should be at the decisive point. Franklin is miles away from the decisive point. So Martel does this, he organizes this attack. He's having to make up how to do it because it's completely counter to what's in the British doctrine. He's having to make something up. He's got troops who've never worked together. The troops of 151st Brigade, a couple of battalions of the Durham Light Infantry, they've never worked with tanks before. This is the irony. Martel's an experienced armoured commander. His troops have no experience of armour. He's linking them with 1st Army Tank Brigade, 2 battalions of that, 4th and 7th RTR. They've had no training with the infantry for the last several months. So you've got some troops who've never trained with each other, haven't met before, and they're being put together. And I think, again, that point about the failures of the British command, there are about 5 divisions of British troops available. The attack is launched with 4 battalions. If you tot it all up, there's probably in the region of about 10 brigades of British troops in that area. The attack goes in with the equivalent of 1. And it's on the basis of, well, we're just trying to clear the area south of Arras, aren't we? So the attack goes in, and it's an astonishing success. So it takes the Germans completely by surprise, and the Matilda tanks turn out to be, in some respects, perfectly designed. The German anti-tank shells bounce off them, and there's accounts of one of the tanks they discovered had been hit 12 times, and not a single time had the shell penetrated. They only realised that they were being shot at, that there'd be a bang, and a bit of the armour next to them would glow red from the heat, but they'd just carry on. The infantry tank design, in many respects, proves itself absolutely. The Germans have nothing they can do about this. Their anti-tank guns fire, and they fire away and achieve nothing. And they get literally run over by the British tanks. The crews run away, or try to surrender, or just get killed. And there's the starting of a rout in the German army, in the German forces. And this is 7th Panzer Division, and then the British penetrate through 7th Panzer and hit the SS Totenkopf Division behind them. And it is about to go horrendously wrong for the Germans. This could be the campaign winning, which would then have been the war winning move. And then it all falls apart. And it falls apart really for 2 reasons. One is that the British have totally failed to do combined arms. So the tanks are doing this amazing work. The infantry are some miles behind them, and they haven't caught up. They haven't been able to work with the tanks, and so you've got tanks against a combined arms opposition. And after a while, that is going to tell. And what happens is that the German field artillery over open sights are able to engage the British tanks. And whereas the 37mm anti-tank guns bounce off, you've got a field gun firing a shell at you, that's going to hurt. Now, if the infantry had been with the tanks, they would have been able to suppress the field guns, and the attack would have been able to penetrate further. But the infantry is some distance behind, so that's a failing. But they run into Rommel. And Rommel does his thing of he's somewhere else when this starts. He rushes back because he's heard that his troops are under attack. There's something really strange going on. He spots that this is the decisive point. He comes back. He personally goes from field gun to field gun and says, right, that tank, shoot at it. And there's some absolutely fascinating research done by a chap called David Rowland, who used to work for the MOD, who did psychological analysis of what happens in battle. And he's done this incredible analysis about the effectiveness of guns in battle, and has shown that effectively, if you have a gun or indeed an individual tank that's just operating on its own, it's the junior soldiers operating it, those guns fight at about 10% effectiveness. If you have an officer by the gun, it fights at 100% effectiveness. So Rommel gets himself and his senior staff, and they put not just an officer, you've got a major general at the, and if you've got a major general standing next to you and saying, right, you point that gun that way, fire it, you're going to do it. And so Rommel gets in, classic example of the German doctrine, and he gets his field guns. The crews don't run away. They know they're being effective, and they've got a general standing right over them telling them what to do. And so the British tanks, lots of them get destroyed, and they have to pull back. And so the attack effectively grinds to a halt and has to pull back. So in that sense, it's been failure, but it is this thing of winning a victory despite losing the battle. So this is what the Germans are expecting the British to do all along, because German doctrine, German thinking since the 1890s has been a penetration of the enemy front is the most dangerous operation that you can possibly undertake, because by penetrating the enemy front, you are making it really easy for the enemy to encircle you and to cut you off. So it's a really dangerous thing to do. And that's why Schlieffen, throughout the 1890s and into the early 20th century, was saying, don't penetrate, encircle. The whole Schlieffen plan thing, the Cannae model, it's all about encirclement because penetration is dangerous. What's going on in May 1940? It's a penetration. And the German commanders are thinking, oh my goodness, we are doing something which all of our training tells us is the most dangerous thing you can possibly do. And we know the Allies have strong forces on either side of our penetration. Surely they're going to do the thing that we would do, which is they're going to counterattack behind our thrust. And lo and behold, they do at Arras. And so you can see it rippling up the chain of command. All of the German commanders go, oh my goodness. Oh, hang on. Right. Okay, they're doing what we expected them to do. They're doing what the doctrine says that they should do. This is incredibly dangerous. We really need to be careful. And hence you have the halt order. And that's not Hitler. That's Rundstedt. So that is the German army, that German commanders saying, right, we have got into this situation, which we always thought we would. Right, let's pause. Let's get the infantry up. Let's solidify the penetration, which is what you should do. But the difference is that Rundstedt has managed to get more and more nervous. Every day he's doing something which is absolutely counter to what he's been trained to do. And you can almost imagine the ghost of Schlieffen sat on his shoulder saying, what the hell do you think you're doing here? And so he's incredibly nervous about this. But he's retreated more and more into his headquarters. So between the 16th and the 26th of June, he doesn't leave his headquarters. Remember, this is a German army that says you find out what's going on by going to the front line. For 10 days, he sits in his headquarters. His subordinate commanders from Rommel upwards are at the front line, and they say, okay, the British and French have attacked, and it's important that we don't forget that the French did attack. There was a French division there as well. It tends to get sort of airbrushed out of history because after all, the French were useless, weren't they? Actually, they attacked just as much as we did. The commanders from Rommel upwards are saying, oh, hang on. Yes, they did this attack, but they haven't done anything since. They haven't made any effort to follow this up. So maybe they're not going to. And so Rommel gets less concerned, and then his corps commander gets less concerned, and his army commander gets less concerned, because they're all at the front line and seeing what's going on. And it takes days for Rundstedt to realise what's going on. So you have a position where the attack actually, to some extent, achieves exactly what it was intended to, but the British and French don't take advantage of it, and therefore they end up losing the battle. It's funny because it strikes me as being demonstrating everything that's problematic about about the British doctrine. Yet the Germans seem to have it causes them a bit of a flap, but actually does it not confirm exactly how well they're doing with their doctrine? It's really just a speed bump, because whilst the British attack, they're able to take control of the situation, not have a linear front, soak it up, stop them, at which point the British don't know what they're doing because they're not really got
any clue what their objectives ultimately meant to be.
And I think the key element here is that the British and French had already lost in their minds. The fact that the Germans had penetrated the front at the Meuse, it was, well, we've lost, haven't we? Because of course, the whole thing in 1918 was when the Germans attacked. Then it was, backs to the wall. We have to stop the Germans reaching the sea and splitting the British and French armies. In the middle of May 1940, they've done it, and I think there is deeply psychologically within the British and French commanders, there's a sense of we've lost. And so therefore what this is about is getting out, as opposed to, oh, this is a really dangerous situation, but we've still got huge forces available to us, and the Germans are in a very dangerous position. So I'm in no doubt the Allies could have won in 1940 had they acted vigorously and decisively. But the German doctrine was that you did, and the British doctrine was that you tried to impose order and you were thoughtful and planned and methodical. And that isn't going to work in that kind of situation.
Well, we're going to have to revisit the rest of the war when the next book comes out, because that it's fascinating. But do you want to dip your toe in and give us does Britain understand the failings of doctrine? Do they come back with an updated manual, repeated manuals? You've got a lot of learning to do.
There are lots of manuals, and I think the short answer is no. So the British response. So there's a fascinating document, the Bartholomew Report, which gets written during June 1940, and it's a really quite an impressive process. That from the point where the British say, oh, we need to have a review, to the point where it gets published and in fact gets distributed to the army is less than a month. So it's quite an impressive. It's a very rapid process, and it's actually quite thorough. However, it's fundamentally flawed because it basically starts from the premise of we got it right from a doctrinal perspective, we got it right from a command perspective. So we must have lost because of the troops and because of the RAF. And that's why we lost. And essentially, that's what stays throughout the war, which is, right, we need to be methodical, we need to be cautious, we need to be planned. And every time that the quick-thinking Germans run rings around us, it just reinforces that, oh, right, well, we need to be even more thoughtful and even more methodical and even more planned. And of course, that's what Montgomery does. And Montgomery is the master of the planned, methodical battle. And ultimately, when you've got massive material superiority, it works. And so Britain does win the war alongside the Americans. And of course, the material superiority, there's 70 American divisions in Europe by the end of the war. I mean, Montgomery's got about 15. So there's massive material superiority. In that situation, you can just use the mincer machine and grind your way through. And there's no amount of slipperiness and initiative and flexibility that is going to be able to deal with that. And so ultimately, we win on that basis. And of course, it's the same on the Eastern Front. The Soviet army wins because they've got 1,000 tanks and the Germans have got 12. And, even if those 12 German tanks destroy 200 Russian Soviet tanks, they're still going to lose. And so ultimately, the British learn that it is mass and method that will win you a victory. And of course, that's then, turning the circle still further in the 1980s, we then realized that we didn't have the mass. And that's when we started looking back at the Germans and saying, well, hang on, they did quite well against mass. And that's where the whole philosophy of mission command comes in, because it's that if you haven't got mass, method and preparation isn't going to work. So you need something different.
Yeah, it acts as a force multiplier. Right, well, we'll leave it there. Thanks, Martin. Since reading your book, I have been quoting it back to people. It is absolutely superb. Loyal listener, if you want to know more about doctrine and how it affected the fighting in 1940, read Piercing the Fog of War, The Theory and Practice of Command in the British and German Armies 1918-1940. Well, that is all for this episode. Don't forget, if you regularly enjoy the show, why not sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.